welcome to part 2 in this series of audios about bereavement. This talk is entitled The Emotional Journey. In the last audio, I spoke about the importance of emotional responsiveness and the importance of being able to understand something of the way that we're feeling during any kind of emotionally challenging period in our lives. And of course, bereavement is a profoundly challenging experience. It can be one of the most devastating experiences that we ever have. I spoke about the need to understand the way that we're feeling so that we can become both responsive to ourselves and also so that we can seek out and ask for the responsiveness that we need from others around us. When we don't understand what we're feeling and when we become frightened of the way that we feel, then we really will add to the intensity of our emotional experience. We'll add to any kind of emotional overload. In this audio, I'm going to talk about the actual process of bereavement, the emotional journey that takes place, and how this tends to work. And I'm also going to talk about some of the really key emotions that are always present in this journey. Now, some of the emotions that I'm going to talk about will be the kind of things that we know we're going to feel, the kind of things that we expect to feel. But I'll also talk about some of the more unexpected and challenging emotions as well. We very frequently feel an awful lot more than just the things that we thought we were going to feel. And the complexity of these feelings and the confusion and the conflict that they can cause inside of us can really add to the emotional overload. It turns up our emotional volume control and gives us additional anxiety about the way that we're already feeling. So let's first of all talk about the actual process of bereavement, this emotional journey of grieving, this very, very challenging process of change. I often liken the process of bereavement to the installation and running of a new program on a computer. When we first install and load a new program, all of the available memory and the processing capacity in that computer will primarily be involved and tied up in installing that program, getting it set up and running it. And so while that's happening, the computer won't actually be able to necessarily run all of its usual programs in the way that it would normally do so. In fact, initially, this may be the only program you can actually run. In the primary stages of loss, this program can take over completely. And once it's started, you can't actually stop it. It needs to run its course. And the length of time that it's going to take is going to be dependent upon individual circumstances. There isn't a fixed time. There's no specific time scale. And this program will be unique to you. It will be individual to you. And likewise, every loss that we have in the course of our lives will also be unique and individual. There'll be similarities, but fundamentally, every loss we ever experience will be unique and individual every time. Remember in the first audio I spoke about the fact that there's always a relativity, something of the nature of the kind of relationship that we had with the person who's died will be reflected in the way in which we grieve. Something of the kind of relationship that we had with this person will be present in the contents of the bereavement program that we're running. Now, while this program is running, there's a whole process of reconfiguration that needs to take place, and it's an internal reconfiguration. And as I'm sure anyone who's ever used a computer will know, if you install a new and massive program, while it's installing and reconfiguring itself, everything else will slow down. The whole system's going to struggle to function while this massive program is going on in the background. Indeed, some of the other programs that we're used to running on a daily basis will actually stop working altogether. And when we do try to get on with some of the usual daily programs that we're familiar with using, we'll find that they either aren't working properly, or they slow down beyond measure, or they're simply not functioning at all anymore, they don't work, or they don't work in the way that they used to. Now, this impacts in a variety of ways. It doesn't necessarily mean that we've lost these programs, but it does mean that the system won't be running either as fast or in the way that we're used to, and at least for a little while, your access to the full memory of the computer will probably not be functioning as usual either. It won't be available. Another thing you may find is that you get the equivalent of pop-ups every now and then, rather like the things that come up on the computer screen when you least expect them. And whether you like it or not, you have to deal with them because they're there. I'll talk more about this in the next audio, but suffice it to say that these pop-ups can come in a variety of different formats. They may be memories, which literally arrive, sometimes endlessly, and sometimes completely unexpectedly, and they may also be emotions. Our emotions will arrive like waves, and the intensity of them won't necessarily be consistent. In one moment our feelings can come in gentle waves, and yet in what feels like a millisecond, these gentle waves can suddenly turn into the storm of the century with the equivalent of an emotional tsunami. And we can feel totally overwhelmed and knocked off our feet by the power and force. Many people find they can actually become quite frightened of their own emotions when this happens, particularly if this happens when they thought that they were picking up and getting back into some kind of daily routine and some kind of normality. All of a sudden, seemingly out of the blue, just when we thought this epic program was settling down, something can happen and up comes the equivalent of a massive series of pop-ups. And I think it's useful to know that this can happen, because whenever we have some understanding of what to expect, when it does happen, it can take a little bit of the power out of it. We can sort of know that even if we're bowled over by the way that we feel, if we understand that it's a normal response and that it's okay, it's useful for us to know that even if it happened unexpectedly, it doesn't mean we've gone backwards by 1,000,000 miles. It's simply part of this ongoing process. We can also find that as this process continues, something of our internal structure and programming becomes completely reconfigured. So although we may not exactly have lost a particular program, it just simply doesn't work in the same way anymore. It's different. Something of our default operating system or our factory settings aren't the way they were anymore, and this is completely understandable. If we've lost someone who was important to us, someone who played a key role in our life, then a big component in our default system will be missing. So whatever happens, it won't actually be the same as it was when they were an integral part of our world, when they were part of our internal system. We're unlikely to see things in quite the same way. When we lose someone very important to us, we're highly likely to see the world in a different way and to relate to the world in a different way after they've gone. It doesn't mean we won't move on, and it doesn't mean we won't pick up, and it doesn't mean we won't rebuild our lives, but it simply means that things will be different. I've already spoken about the importance of our ability to understand and process our emotional experiences during such an important time in our lives. Now, while we're using the analogy of a computer, I can genuinely speak for myself and say that as far as computer programs go, if something goes wrong, I'm out of my depth and I'm going to need to go and get some help. As far as IT systems go, it's out of my comprehension. I simply don't speak the language. I think it's really fair to say that many people haven't grown up in a world where they actually have an emotional language. They haven't learned to be emotionally fluent. And just like me and IT, if we don't have a language, we may need help to manage the sheer enormity of the programs that are running. And that's okay. It's really important that we can be emotionally supported during this time, and that we can receive the level of emotional responsiveness that we need from both others and from ourselves. I'll say a lot more about this in the chapter about self-care. So let's talk about the emotions that are almost always present in the running of this epic program. Some of them I think we can easily understand and relate to, and some of them we tend to find more challenging. And although I'm going to talk about them in a particular order, it doesn't mean that you'll necessarily experience them in this order. Remember, every process of bereavement is absolutely unique and individual. There'll be lots of common denominators, but ultimately, every bereavement will be slightly different. The first thing that I'm going to talk about is shock. Shock and disbelief. Even if the person that we've lost has been ill for some time and their death was expected, at some point we're highly likely to feel both shock and disbelief. This tends to happen fairly early on, but not always. Now, shock will affect different people in different ways. For some people, a natural response is to kick into a kind of doing mode, and this is a very normal response. When something happens that's out of our control, then needing to be in control and to do things that enable us to feel as though we can take charge again and regain some kind of control in our lives is a very, very human response, and sometimes a very helpful one. Although if this doing response distances us too much from our feelings, then inevitably they'll resurface again at some point. They do need to be thoughtfully responded to. Now, for other people, they can find themselves completely unable to do. Sometimes when we're in a state of shock, we can really lose any kind of normal functionality in our lives. The devastation of our loss can feel insurmountable and absolutely disabling. And when this happens, we're going to need to have some practical responsiveness from the people around us, as well as some external emotional support to help us to manage this level of overwhelming feeling. Sometimes shock can leave us feeling quite numb. We can feel distance from the situation and distance from ourselves. Some people describe it as being outside of themselves looking in. When this happens, again, it's a completely natural response. It's a natural way of distancing ourselves from something that feels too overwhelming. When this happens, although it may be helpful in the immediacy of things, it is after all an instinctive coping strategy. Because it distances us from our feelings, they will inevitably resurface again at some point, and they will need an emotionally thoughtful response. Interestingly enough, sometimes when someone does feel numb or distance from their feelings, this can sometimes trigger or set off some guilt because they're not feeling the way that they think they should be feeling. Before I move on to talk about other emotions, including guilt, let's talk about disbelief. This is really, really common, especially in the early stages of loss, although it's a pop-up that can reoccur. Disbelief is actually connected to both shock and to the reconfiguration process that I spoke about when I used the analogy of the computer program. The system hasn't yet adjusted to the reality of how it is now. The system doesn't feel real, and the loss of the person doesn't feel real. It's as though they're still here and we can feel as though they're going to just walk through that door. Sometimes people talk about thinking that they've seen the person who's just died, mistaking someone who from behind looked familiar, that kind of situation. Somehow a part of us can't yet imagine the world without them in it. And interestingly enough, this isn't only with people that we cared for or loved. Sometimes if we had a particularly difficult relationship with someone, it can be equally hard to believe that they're finally gone. And even talking about them can seem unnatural and inappropriate, as if they're still around and they might be able to hear us. So let's talk more about guilt. This is one of the more unexpected emotions that's always present during this process, and it arrives in a variety of different ways. Sometimes it can come in the form of wishing we'd done more with that person, wishing we'd spent more time with them. Sometimes if we didn't get the chance to say goodbye, maybe we were on our way to see them but we didn't arrive in time, or we'd left the room for just one moment and then they died. All of these kinds of situations can generate guilt, and we can find that we go over and over things which we can't actually change. Our mind can be plagued with what-ifs and if-onlys. Sometimes, if someone was terminally ill and their last few months were long and hard, although we feel relief when any suffering is finally over, we can then also feel guilty for feeling that way. Sometimes people feel as though if they stop thinking about the person for just one moment, it's as though they'll lose their memory of them forever, and this can set off guilt as well. And as I said earlier, if we've gone into shock and are feeling numb, we can actually end up feeling guilty because we don't feel the way that we think we should be feeling. Also, if we had any difficulties with the person who's died, or any unresolved issues with them, then this can also generate guilt, and this can really get in the way of us moving through this powerful emotional process. I'll talk more about this in the next audio. And as we do begin to move through this massive emotional process, we can also feel guilty about moving on, about getting on with life, about rebuilding a life without that person, guilty about having life. Whenever we experience any kind of traumatic loss, guilt will always have a massive presence. If we've been involved in an accident and we've survived but someone else didn't, we may well suffer from survivor's guilt. And if we lose a child, which I actually think is without doubt the hardest and the most incomprehensible loss of all, we can be plagued with a form of survivor's guilt, wishing that it had been us rather than them. And in any kind of suicide, guilt will be a big part of the complex legacy that this kind of death leaves behind. Something you may have noticed as I've been talking is that guilt is very frequently attached to other emotions. I think if I was going to draw guilt as a picture or a visual image, I would draw it like a fishing line with hooks on it. Because guilt tends to hook into other emotions and to other experiences. It attaches itself, and when guilt becomes tied to something or attached to something, it can weigh it down and make it harder to work through something. It can hold us back and it can get in the way. What I will say though is that guilt is actually an incredibly valuable emotion, providing we have it in the right quantity. If we didn't have any guilt at all, then we wouldn't be able to develop a conscience. So it's actually a very important emotion, but one that can sometimes overload and hold us back if we're carrying too much of it or we're carrying it inappropriately. So back to the need to understand the way that we feel. If we have a good relationship with our emotions, and we can recognise what we're feeling, and we can understand what's going on for us, then all of our emotions actually become valuable. They become a good source of guidance and information. They're letting us know what's going on, and they're giving us clues as to what we need to attend to. During the running of this epic program, most of us will associate and expect to experience acute sadness and acute painful loss. And however difficult this is, because we understand and expect this, somehow it can feel a little bit more acceptable than some of the other more challenging feelings. And we can also often feel that other people are generally sympathetic about loss and sadness. And we're often also able to be sympathetic to ourselves, at least in the beginning. Something that I've heard so many times though is that people can feel very supported initially following a death. But over time, even though this epic program is still running strong, we can feel as though everyone else thinks that we should be over it and that we should have moved on or finished grieving. But this isn't always the case, and this can feel really difficult because if we're needing and looking for responsiveness from those around us, but we feel as though that level of support isn't available, or as if it's frowned upon, if we're getting what feels like a critical response, it can make it really hard to feel okay about being responsive to ourselves as well, even if deep down we know that we need to be. Sometimes we can even think this ourselves, and we can give ourselves a very hard time for not moving forwards quickly enough. And this kind of inner criticism is actually quite unhelpful, and it has a significant impact on our self-esteem. Interestingly enough, even if we lose someone that we didn't like very much, even if we had a difficult or an abusive relationship with them, we'll still experience loss, and this can feel quite disconcerting if it's the very last thing that we thought that we'd feel. And this is because loss itself is actually multifaceted. Loss is never ever just about one thing. In every loss that we experience in the course of our lives, as well as the primary loss, the actual person who died, there are always what I call secondary losses. Now, if I was going to draw this and make a visual image, I would draw it like a spider diagram, with the person that we've lost in the middle, and then all the other losses coming out like legs from the centre. Let me give you some examples of the kind of things that I mean. Some examples of secondary losses. Let's say that you lost someone who was really close to you, maybe an important figure in your childhood, someone you've relied on. Then one of your secondary losses might be a feeling of stability or safety. You'll have lost something that this person used to bring and contribute to your life. It doesn't mean you won't get this feeling back, but you will feel the loss of it nevertheless. Here's another example. If you lost a parent and then you get married or have a baby, you will have lost their involvement and presence at such an important life moment. And this will be a very important secondary loss to be aware of. Here's another example. If as a child you lost a sibling, then you may have lost the attention of your parents who were grieving. So that's an additional loss, a secondary loss. Likewise, if you lost someone who you had a dreadful relationship with, let's say someone who had abused you as a child, for example, you might think that when they die you'll feel relief and safety. And whilst you may well feel this, one of your secondary losses will be that you need to grieve for the loss of your childhood, the loss of your innocence, and any opportunities that you didn't feel able to take as a result of your history. These secondary losses are very important, and they need to be grieved for as well. I'm going to say an awful lot more about these complexities in the next audio. The last and particularly challenging emotion that I'm going to talk about now is anger. People are often incredibly surprised at the sheer amount of anger that surfaces during the process of grieving. And because it's an emotion that for many people has such negative associations, it's a really tough one to try and sort out. Just as guilt tends to be seen very negatively, but actually plays a very important emotional role for us, the same applies to anger. If we think about anger as a pure emotional component, it's the emotional component that fuels us into having a sense of justice. At its best, it fuels pride, passion, assertiveness, and channeled well, it can be used to generate extraordinary good in the world. Obviously, at its worst, it's about hatred, violence, and abuse. It's interesting because when we suppress our anger, we tend to lose our motivation and our drive. We lose our passion. Now, it's actually completely natural to feel angry if something that we like or we love is taken away from us. So anger in the process of grieving is a very natural and appropriate response. When we lose someone that we loved very much, it's pretty healthy to feel angry about this. And depending on the nature of the relationship that we had with this person, deep down we may even feel quite abandoned by them, and this will naturally generate anger. Likewise, if we lose someone and there are some complex secondary losses, like the loss of part of our childhood, this can also bring up a lot of anger and a lot of rage. Sometimes losing someone can feel totally unfair, and this will also generate a massive feeling of injustice and, of course, anger and rage. Sometimes we may feel angry at ourselves, sometimes we may feel angry at others. We may feel angry at God, or we may feel angry at the person who's died. Sometimes we simply don't know where to direct our anger, or we may just feel that we shouldn't feel this way at all, that we're wrong or bad for feeling this way. Maybe our anger is feeling completely in conflict with our loss and our sadness. In whatever shape or form it comes, anger will always be present somewhere in this powerful emotional process of grieving. And this massive program, once it's started, will need to run its course. Now, if any of these more challenging feelings have ever been difficult for us in the past, then when we feel these powerful emotions, this can connect us to all kinds of painful memories and difficult associations. And so, despite the fact that they're a completely natural part of this process, it can make it really hard to understand the way that we're feeling and to work out what's going on inside of us. In the next audio, I'm going to talk about these kind of complexities and the kind of relativity that I spoke about in the first audio. I'm also going to talk about the way that unresolved issues from the past sometimes resurface during the process of grieving. Thank you for listening and take care. This is copyrighted material 2014, Jenny Burgess, The A to Z of Emotional Health. All rights reserved.